In early 1968, Andy Warhol was forced to leave his famous silver factory and relocate to Union Square, at the time the scene of regular muggings and casual shootings. By now, Andy and his gang had become a fixture at New York parties and at the factory's favourite restaurant, Max's Kansas City, where Debbie Harry waited table. They were the hippest gatecrashers and the strangest customers.
I would look at them and I would think they had sort of all been transported there from the Middle Ages or something. They really were phenomenal looking. It was sort of odd, you know, how that happens, I think.
To go in a group, how intelligent. He never went anywhere by himself. In a group, because one you can break, but you cannot break six. And six hear more and see more.
We were also extremely sexy.
The invasion was by sheer numbers. There would be about a dozen of us. And we'd all be flying on methamphetamine.
Max's was the most insane place in the world because you had to be a drug addict, a model, a movie star, or look like one.
The beautiful, wealthy Edie Sedgwick was a valuable new recruit to the Warhol clan. This poor little rich girl not only became Andy's passport to high society, but also his most likely candidate for superstardom.
Warhol liked her so much. She fit into what he needed. She looked, you know, like the next hip girl, the next thing. She also looked like him. I mean, she had that short hair and everything. She also was rich. He loved rich. He definitely liked rich.
He thought Edie Sedgwick would be his ticket to Hollywood, and directed her and rehearsed her, and then the woman showed up on drugs and nothing happens.
Impatient for her promised stardom, Edie eventually left Warhol, only to die of a drug overdose in 1971. She wasn't the first factory casualty. The dancer Freddie Herco had committed suicide in 1964.
I was startled by the coldness of his reaction to almost all the deaths. When Edie died, he said, "Oh, gee, I wonder if she left me any money." That was his initial response. When Freddie Herco leapt out of the window on an OD, he said to me, "Oh, isn't it too bad we didn't have a camera there to shoot him spiraling down 5 flights?" That was the instantaneous reaction.
Part of this notion of I want to be a machine, it's not any kind of machine he wants to be. He wants to be a recording machine. And I think this idea of the record is very, very crucial to him. When Freddie Herco committed suicide, Andy's response was, "I wish he had called me so I could have gone and filmed it." And people say, see, he just cared about, you know, how he could exploit that suicide. But I actually think that he had the courage of the statement, "I want to be a machine," which is to say that if you've decided you want to kill yourself, I want to give it the dignity of an artistic record.
They saw him as sucking everybody's blood, you know, and of using everybody else's ideas, and of being a kind of vampire in that way.
I didn't care if Warhol was Dracula. It's fine with me. It's better than, you know, Mom and Dad.
Drella, they called him. Somewhere between Dracula and Cinderella.
10 years later, Andy would actually manifest this Drella personality for friend and photographer Christopher Makos, and for his own instant Polaroids. Perhaps the odd-looking artist could transform himself into a good-looking woman, like one of his transvestite factory superstars, or appear as a fading film actress, plucked from the pages of one of his movie star scrapbooks. But Andy was by now creating his own brand of movie legend. Chelsea Girls, a twin-screen experiment part scripted by Ronnie Tavel and presided over by Paul Morrissey, was the first avant-garde film to make the variety charts on its release in 1966. It went on to play commercially in major cities throughout America.
That
had a profound effect, I think, on college kids who saw it, like myself, because it was the first movie that dealt with drugs, that showed people taking drugs and talking under the influence of drugs, dealt with homosexuality, bisexuality, transvestites. It was all this stuff that had never been seen before.
The success of Chelsea Girls meant that more people than ever were knocking on the factory door in the hope of making it to the big screen, like model hustler Joe D'Alessandro.
A friend of mine said, "Oh, you ever hear this artist named Andy Warhol? He does these paintings of Campbell's soup, and all I recognized was the word Campbell's soup, and I had no idea who he was." And I said, "Yeah, I know that soup." He was sitting behind the camera, and he was reading the newspaper. And I think he popped his head out only one time, so the whole time I was there, I only saw him for a second when he put the newspaper down. And I don't even know if he was reading it or he was hiding behind it, because he would laugh. All of a sudden, you'd hear a giggle. Basically, Paul would be the one running around telling people what they needed to be doing.
A member of Andy's entourage was Valerie Solanas, lesbian writer and prostitute. She became obsessed with the artist and with the belief that he'd intended to take a script she'd given him and make it into a film without her. On June the 3rd, 1968, Solanas turned up at the factory on Union Square, where she'd been many times before, but this time with a gun. She was about to guarantee her own 15 minutes of fame as the person who shot Andy Warhol.
I heard this loud bang. When I did get out of the darkroom, went up front, Valerie was already gone. Andy was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And I just saw him there, and I went over to him and picked him up in my arms, And I started sobbing and crying, and Andy said, "Oh, Billy, please don't make me laugh. It hurts too much."
I was in Italy at the time making a movie, and I just couldn't believe it. It's the first thing I thought of is if I was there, it wouldn't have happened.
Solanas shot Warhol twice, the bullets passing through 7 internal organs.
The ironies abound because he was pronounced dead twice. And he talks about hearing that and hearing the repetition of it. And what that does is it transforms profoundly what death actually means, particularly for Warhol. It interferes with the idea of the singular, once-in-a-lifetime event. One of the things that I think he was very fascinated by was the actual line between life and death as a line. One of my favorite of his suicide pictures is the 1962 photograph of the man jumping from the window. There's a line that bisects the fall, and that's literally the line between life and death. The leaper is alive. We know from gravity he's going to land, right? He's going to pass through that line. And he began, I think, to really live as if that line would be one among many lines that he would cross.
Before I was shot, I always thought I was more half there than all there. I always suspected that I was watching TV instead of living life. People sometimes say that the way things happen in the movies is unreal. But actually, it's the way things happen to you in life that's unreal. The movies make emotions look so strong and real, whereas when things really do happen to you, it's like watching television. You don't feel anything.
What's unique about Warhol is that he depicted the American dream. The whole world wants the American dream. Now, what's the American dream? Prosperity, the sign of dollar, the glamour, the star, the fame, the beauty. But Warhol actually was pretty smart. He depicted the American dream and the American disasters. The atomic mushroom, suicide, electric chair, of course, JFK shooting. Warhol is the child of capitalism, of American imperialism, and he represented pages of American history as is. In Europe, we have Greek mythology. The mythology here is Hollywood. Hence, Warhol had the idea that he needed superstar, even if they were untalented, to enter the American mythology. That's what he wanted, and he got it.
Warhol once said that in the future everyone would be famous for 15 minutes. His own celebrity had been guaranteed by the shooting, but what would he do next? He confounded all expectations by becoming a publisher. In 1969, he launched the modest film magazine, Interview, a grown-up version of his childhood Hollywood scrapbooks. But this time, he got to meet the stars.
The fact that he had experienced that shooting, and the fact that he had seen kind of the power of fame in the media and not getting what you want, that somewhere it absolutely informed this idea of starting an alternative media vehicle that maybe would treat fame in a different way.
It was at this point that Warhol seemed to tire of movie making. Paul Morrissey rushed in to fill the vacuum and assumed total control of film production at the factory. Morrissey wrote and directed Flesh, Trash and Heat in quick succession under the Warhol banner. Out went Andy's Let It Be experimental approach, and in came more conventional narratives, even if they were played out in the twilight zone of low-life sex and drugs that Andy's factory had come to represent. They all starred Joe D'Alessandro, who became the factory's unlikely matinee idol and independent cinema's first international icon. Trash was so successful that Morrissey and Warhol were able to purchase prime real estate in Montauk with the movie's profits. But with Morrissey now fully engaged in film production, Andy needed a new manager, a role assumed by Fred Hughes, a snobbish Anglophile with impeccable taste and access to some of the richest people in America. He symbolized the new 70s regime at Andy's factory, with its post-Watergate, post-hippie, pro-hedonist Studio 54 ethos. The open house of the 60s now had a bulletproof door, and the new factory personnel were well-educated, bourgeois boys in shirts and ties. This was a new factory, open for business, but closed to Warhol's old associates.
I refer to him sort of as the cardboard Andy after that. You know, the Andy Warhol, you'll stand up outside the theater, the cardboard cut out of him, because he became really flat, and the factory became flat.
After Andy was shot, he suddenly was afraid of people who were crazy, you know, amphetamine drag queens. I think it would be a mistake to say Andy lost his creativity after the shooting.
For now, Andy settled for being the brand name on Morrissey's films. First on a Frankenstein movie, and then on Blood for Dracula, a story of a pale, weak, ineffectual Eastern European count, poisoning himself on the blood of degenerate aristocratic whores. Who or what could have been on Morrissey's mind?
I think Paul didn't like it that everybody says it's Andy Warhol's Dracula, Andy Warhol's Frankenstein, Andy Warhol's Flash. I mean, we all know that Andy made the Empire State Building and other movies. And I don't know if you call that directing either, but I mean, he invented things. In that time when Andy were making movies, they were separating things, modern art and movies. Today, Schnabel, everybody makes, Robert Longo, they're all making movies. But at that period, I think they didn't accept that. That maybe I can imagine that the film industry said, no, he's a painter, let him paint. Let him paint. Let him paint.
That's exactly what Andy did. He withdrew all his own film experiments and entered the 70s working tirelessly on new paintings, many of which are only now being recognized as important works. For the first of these, he chose a surprising subject, Chairman Mao. The instigator of the Cultural Revolution was elevated, or demoted, to the level of Marilyn, to a wallpaper design, and subjected to endless repetition. Andy also continued to work on his own image, most obviously in the hair department. As the decade progressed, so did Andy's wigs. He was blatantly turning himself into a genuine fake.
We have maybe about 50 of his wigs, and they range from being just really yucky and greasy and kind of, as someone said, like roadkill, to the more pristine examples.
He figured out a way to make it really work for him. For me, he didn't have a hairpiece or a wig or any of that. I mean, I know he did, but the way his hair was such a part of who he was that it was inseparable. So it didn't matter if it actually grew from the roots of his scalp. It was him.
I knew the wig guy, made wigs on 42nd Street. He used to bring 2 green boxes in at a time of Andy's wigs, and Andy would then go cut them himself, different lengths. And then why did he dye the back of the wig down here black and white everywhere else?
And they're all two-tone, but they vary. This is Warhol. Apparently Warhol's natural hair color was brown, dark brown.
One of the things he said was that the reason he chose those ghastly wigs for the good bit of his life was that by wearing those, you didn't notice him, you noticed the wig, and also they made him timeless.
Towards the end of his life, he started to formally think of them as works of art and actually framed a couple of them and was planning to do a framed edition of 40 of his wigs.
In the new factory ethos, Andy's love of portraiture was put to increasingly lucrative use. He drastically upped his production of portraits throughout the 70s, while Fred Hughes did the deals. And the going rate? $25,000 for one, or $40,000 a pair.
I never got mine. And when I would go back and ask Andy, he'd say, oh, let's do another. And he did another one, which is really awful. Later, I mean, it's one of my worst periods out of my mind. And okay, probably the right picture. But when you don't see around, very honestly.
But it was his move into commissioned portraits of society ladies, bank presidents, and corporate chieftains that began to get Warhol into trouble, both with his admirers and the critics. The stale smell of selling out began to emanate from the factory.
I wouldn't say it was easy, but he definitely had his method, with the Polaroid, and then you blow it, and then you just leave the eyes and the nostrils and the lips, so even if you're 80, you look beautiful. He was so smart that way, just making everyone look gorgeous. But, for me as a 20-year-old in New York, those society portraits could not interest me in the least. I could not care less about it, and I remember just going, oh, who cares about these uptown people?
One such uptown person was socialite Nan Kempner.
I thought anybody who could make a soup can glamorous had to be a friend of mine. About 6 a.m, the phone rang. Hi, Nan, it's Andy. Picture's terrific. You've got to come down and see it. Well, that was the most conversation I'd ever heard from him. He did 3 of them, each one a different color, and I chose this one because it was my favorite. And the one, I guess, it's in Pittsburgh was his favorite because the third one, he was so cheap he painted over it. His Marilyn Monroe and his Elizabeth Taylor are just the way they'd want to be remembered. And I hope the Nan Kempner, too.
He would never let them have any say about the size. I once asked Andy why he was so adamant that all the portraits had to be 40 inches by 40 inches. And he said, well, because someday I would like the Metropolitan Museum to take one of each person and put them all together as one big interlocking portrait called Portrait of Society. That's what he had in mind.
Warhol will be remembered as the creator of perhaps the most extraordinary bestiary of the second half of the 20th century. And he did that both in paint and in film with the screen tests. I mean, there were 500 screen tests, and there were, I think, over 600 different sitters that he did portraits of. And that's 1,100 people. That's a lot of people.
Commission portraits supported Interview magazine. They supported the films. They supported the video. And there's a great tradition in art of artists doing commission portraits of the ruling class.
That was that whole thing that he's just a society portrait artist in the 70s. He was totally taken for granted. He was doing these wonderful series of paintings, a lot of which were shown in Europe and not in the United States. The art historians were, getting their shovels out and trying to, bury him alive. And the more they tried, the bigger he got.
Business art is the step that comes after art. I started as a commercial artist, and I want to finish as a business artist. Being good in business is the most fascinating kind of art. During the hippie era, people put down the idea of business. They'd say, money is bad and working is bad, but making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art.
By the mid-70s, as if to prove his point, Warhol had transformed Interview magazine into both a unique conceptual artwork and a profitable business. It had become a highly successful expression of his obsession with celebrity, portraiture, pop culture, fashion, cinema, and the now. He had created the prototype for today's celebrity-saturated magazine culture, pioneering the idea of the interview as verbal portrait.
It was almost as if you were eavesdropping, because Andy's idea about doing these interviews would be that everybody, would go to lunch or have breakfast, and it's just that the people at breakfast would be Elizabeth Taylor and Alfred Hitchcock, and of course Andy himself. Interview was his baby. The very first time in my life that I saw Andy Warhol, he was standing on Madison Avenue with the pile of Interview magazines on the corner, giving it out. He would go to parties and he'd come back and say, oh, I met somebody, we have to put them on the cover. They're going to be a really important movie star. And it always seemed, you'd think, oh, he's so crazy. It's just some cute boy or some cute girl that he's met at some party. And of course, that cute guy would turn out to be Tom Cruise.
Interview wasn't only the ideal artistic solution to Warhol's need to be in on everyone's 15 minutes of fame. It also allowed him to indulge his love of business, money, and the multiple.
He wanted every photograph to have someone holding a drink and a cigarette. Because we used to write in the captions under the photograph, Liza Minnelli wearing a Halston dress with shoes by Manolo Blahnik and perfume by Yves Saint Laurent. He wanted it also to say, and cigarettes by Benson and Hedges, and scotch by Chivas Regal. So that would be two more ads we could go and try to get.
But Warhol refused to stand still. In 1974, he became an author, with the publication of his philosophy of art and life. He never actually wrote anything himself. In true Andy style, he gathered around him tax-deductible factory personnel, Bob Colacello, Pat Hackett, and Bridget Berlin, to help his monosyllabic persona find a publishable voice. The team went to work on the first chapter.
I went off and wrote this first chapter, and then Andy read it to Bridget Berlin over the phone and tape recorded her making her comments about my writing. And then he gave that tape to Pat Hackett, who then typed up the tape, and as she did, edited Bridget's comments into my writing and added some of her own writing in what she thought was Andy's voice. And that became, the first chapter. You couldn't just transcribe Andy because there wasn't enough there. You would have to sort of extend his thoughts in his voice.
A good book.
So I think between Pat and I, we gave Andy a literary voice.
People who are extremely dyslexic like he was, they devise ways of masking and hiding their dyslexia. I think his entire life was connected to protecting the liabilities he had, the limitations he had. I think it fascinated him to think his name was on books, because books and writing and literature or sentences were his enemy. It's something he was very frightened of.
Warhol's public image was still that of an artist on the wrong side of the track, the ringmaster of a degenerate art circus full of freaks and transgressors. But every Sunday morning he went to church, loitering at the back, doing exactly what no one really knew. This is his local Catholic church, where he would spend a private 20 minutes before feeding the pigeons. Only then would he indulge in one of his other Sunday vices, shopping at the flea market with Stuart Pevar when all the real bargains were long gone. For Pevar, Andy was a frustrating shopping partner, not least because of his interest in almost anything, including what others might have thought of as junk.
He felt that he was always under tremendous pressure to come up with new subject matter and new ideas, and so he had to flood himself with images and thoughts and everything, and there was no better place to do that than at the flea market, gathering material for his next painting. Andy would look at every single thing, even if there were a million of them. What would the whole, how much would the whole bowl cost?
Both?
The whole thing? All of it?
I don't know.
You don't know? Oh, okay. He doesn't know. I would say, Andy, don't buy that. It's an absolute piece of junk. He would say, yes, Stuart, how much? And he also thought that by buying those kind of things, that it's inevitable that they'll increase in price, because he loved the idea of making money. And one of the ways you could make money, naturally, is by buying cheap and selling dear. Not that he ever sold a thing in his life.